A little girl in a bright pink sweater raised her hand in a crowded grocery store. But she wasn't waving. She was giving a silent rescue signal, and nobody saw it. Nobody except the one person in that store who hadn't been human for 300 years. Her hand went up, thumb tucked, fingers wrapped tight. The man gripping her other hand looked like any tired father. But he wasn't her father. Every shopper walked past. Nobody noticed. Nobody helped. But Rufus Tiberius noticed everything. A wave of terror hit him like a physical blow. His vampire senses detected what humans couldn't, the sharp chemical signature of a child's fear, a small heart racing too fast, a silent scream for help. His body froze. His pale eyes locked on her trembling hand. And a rage he'd buried for centuries suddenly exploded inside him. And the Vampire King had seconds to decide. Stay hidden or save her. Within seconds, the calm supermarket would turn into a scene of confusion, fear, and supernatural intervention. What was this little girl trying to say? Why did the Vampire King recognize the signal instantly when every human around him remained blind to the danger? Stay with us, because what the little girl signaled and what the Vampire King discovered next would uncover a truth so shocking that the entire store would fall silent. Before we continue, make sure to hit like and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. Now let's continue. The grocery store felt unusually peaceful that evening. Fluorescent lights hummed softly above rows of colorful cereal boxes, the clatter of shopping carts blending with murmured conversations, and the occasional squeak of rubber shoes on polished floors. Families wandered through aisles with half-filled baskets, comparing prices, laughing, moving at the slow rhythm of an ordinary day. Nothing about this place hinted that something life-changing was moments away from unfolding. The automatic doors slid open with a mechanical whisper, and Rufus Tiberius stepped into the artificial brightness of Savamart Grocery. Tuesday evening, 7:15. The store was moderately crowded. Enough people to blend in, not so many that the cacophony of heartbeats became unbearable. He'd timed it perfectly, as he always did. The fluorescent lights assaulted his eyes immediately. Even after 3 centuries of adaptation, the harshness of modern lighting remained an irritation he could never quite escape. He kept his gaze low, letting his platinum hair fall slightly forward to shield his face, and moved toward the shopping carts with the careful, measured steps of someone who'd spent lifetimes learning to appear ordinary. Rufus pulled a cart free from the nested row, the metal cold against his pale hands. He didn't need it. Hadn't needed groceries since 1724. But humans with empty hands drew attention, aroused suspicion. Humans shopped. Humans filled carts with things they would consume and replace and consume again in the endless cycle of mortal existence. So Rufus Tiberius, Vampire King, pretended to shop. His long black coat swept behind him as he moved into the produce section, an ornate thing with silver embroidery at the cuffs and collar, styled like something from a forgotten century yet somehow not entirely out of place in this modern world. People glanced at him occasionally. Hipster, they probably thought. Gothic-centric. Never the truth. He picked up an apple, turned it in his fingers, set it gently in his cart. The gesture was mechanical, practiced. Around him, the store pulsed with life in a way only he could perceive. Thump-thump, thump-thump, thump-thump. Heartbeats. Dozens of them. Each one a steady drum playing its own rhythm, all blending into a symphony of mortality that filled his ears like white noise. The young mother by the bananas, heart rate slightly elevated, caffeine perhaps, or the stress of wrangling 2 small children. The elderly man near the lettuce, heart slower, irregular, a weakening muscle counting down its final beats. The teenage stock boy, pulse quick and strong, utterly unaware of how fragile that strength truly was. Rufus had learned to filter it out mostly. The constant reminder of what he'd lost, what he'd become. This was why he came here. Not for food. Not for necessity. But for this, the observation of human normalcy, the study of what he could no longer be. In the grocery store, humans were at their most mundane, their most vulnerable, their most beautifully, foolishly alive. They worried about prices and expiration dates. They compared brands. They made small talk about weather and traffic. They had no idea a predator walked among them. A woman passed him in the aisle, her perfume a cloying cloud that made his nose itch. He offered a polite nod. She smiled back, already forgetting his face. But forgettable was the goal. Unremarkable. Human. The effort of it exhausted him sometimes. The careful modulation of his movements so they didn't appear too fluid, too fast. The deliberate addition of breath he didn't need. The rise and fall of his chest purely theatrical. The practiced warmth in his expression when his face's natural state had settled into aristocratic coldness decades ago. He moved deeper into the store, past the dairy section where the cold didn't affect him, past the bakery where the scent of fresh bread meant nothing to senses that no longer registered food as sustenance. His cart gained a loaf of wheat bread, a carton of milk that would sit in whatever temporary residence he was using until it spoiled, and he threw it away unopened. Pretense. Always the pretense. Around him, children laughed. Couples debated dinner plans. An announcement crackled over the intercom about a sale on frozen pizza. Life, in all its trivial, precious glory, continued without pause. And Rufus Tiberius walked through it like a ghost, visible but untouchable, present but forever apart. He turned into aisle 7, the cereal aisle, bright boxes promising sweetness and energy to those who still broke their fast each morning. His sensitive eyes swept across the products with practiced disinterest. That's when the smell hit him. Not cereal. Not the industrial floor cleaner or the faint mildew from the store's aging ventilation system. Fear. Pure distilled childhood terror. His body went rigid. His fingers tightened on the cart handle, the metal groaning slightly under pressure he forgot to restrain. 300 years of careful control, and a scent he hadn't expected shattered it in an instant. Somewhere in this mundane suburban grocery store, a child was afraid. And every predatory instinct Rufus had spent centuries burying roared suddenly, violently to life. The scent wasn't just a smell. That was the first thing humans never understood about vampire senses. Fear wasn't simply detected, it was experienced. It had texture, dimension, presence. Rufus stood frozen in aisle 7, his cart forgotten, as the sensation washed over him in waves. To a human, fear might register as a faint chemical change, perhaps a slight sharpness in the air. To Rufus it was a living thing. He could taste it on his tongue, metallic and bitter like copper mixed with salt. It coated the back of his throat, making his centuries-dormant predatory glands activate despite himself. But it was more than taste. Fear had a frequency, a vibration that resonated in his bones. Somewhere close, very close, a heart was beating too fast. Not the elevated pace of exercise or caffeine, but the frantic, trapped animal rhythm of genuine terror. The blood moving through small veins was singing a high-pitched song of distress that cut through every other heartbeat in the store like a violin solo piercing through an orchestra. Thump, 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 thump. Too fast. Too young. Rufus's head turned slowly, mechanically, his pale eyes scanning the aisle. The other shoppers remained oblivious. A man comparing granola bars, a woman texting while her cart blocked half the passage, an elderly couple debating oatmeal flavors. None of them felt it. None of them heard that desperate cardiac symphony. But he did. His hands gripped the cart handle so tightly the metal buckled slightly beneath his fingers. The predatory instinct that had sustained him through 3 centuries roared to the surface, ancient and undeniable. Every muscle in his body coiled tight, ready to spring. His vision sharpened until he could see individual dust motes floating in the fluorescent light. His hearing amplified until he could distinguish 17 separate heartbeats within a 50-foot radius. Hunt, something inside him whispered. Prey. Fear means prey. But then confusion cut through the predatory haze. This wasn't right. This wasn't the fear he'd learned to recognize over lifetimes of feeding, the sudden spike of terror when prey realized what he was, the desperate final moments before surrender. This was different. Deeper. More complex. This was helplessness. Desperation. Plea wrapped in panic. This wasn't prey fear. This was a child's distress. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Somewhere in this mundane grocery store, within these brightly lit aisles designed for safety and convenience, a child was terrified. Not of monsters or darkness or things that go bump in the night. Of something real. Something human. The frequency intensified, pulling at him like a magnetic force. His body moved before his mind fully processed the decision, abandoning his cart, gliding toward the source with the fluid grace he usually suppressed. The scent grew stronger, sharper, more immediate. He could almost taste the adrenaline now, the stress hormones flooding a small body system. 15 feet away. In. 5. His eyes swept the aisle with predatory precision, hunting not for prey but for the source of that terrible, compelling fear. And then he saw her. A little girl in a bright pink sweater, her small hand engulfed in a tattooed adult grip. Her face carefully neutral in that way children learn when showing emotion becomes dangerous. But her heart told the truth her face concealed. Terror. Pure and absolute. And Rufus Tiberius, who hadn't cared about a human's fear in 300 years, suddenly cared very much indeed. She was small. That was Rufus's first coherent thought as his eyes locked onto the girl. Perhaps 7 years old, with shoulder-length brown hair that caught the fluorescent light in soft waves. The bright pink sweater she wore seemed deliberately cheerful, aggressively normal, the kind of clothing meant to signal everything is fine, we belong here, nothing to see. But her eyes told a different story entirely. Too wide. The kind of wideness that came not from wonder or curiosity, but from fear stretched so thin it threatened to shatter. Brown eyes that should have been studying cereal boxes or begging for sugary treats instead darted constantly, desperately, searching the faces of passing strangers with the frantic hope of a drowning person looking for a lifeline. Those eyes held too much knowledge for a Tuesday evening grocery run. Too much terror for a simple errand with family. Rufus's gaze shifted to the man holding her hand. Tattooed arms, the ink dark and heavy, a snake coiling around one muscular forearm, visible beneath the rolled sleeves of a blue denim shirt. Late 30s, perhaps early 40s. Strong build, the kind that came from physical labor or dedicated gym time. His jaw was set too tight, tendons standing out in his neck. His free hand twitched at his side, fingers flexing and relaxing in an irregular rhythm that spoke of barely controlled nerves. The grip on the girl's hand was wrong. Too tight. Possessive rather than protective. Her small fingers disappeared completely in his larger palm, and even from 15 feet away, Rufus could see the whiteness around her knuckles where circulation was being restricted. The man's eyes moved constantly, not browsing products, not comparing prices, but scanning, calculating. His gaze swept across exit signs, swept across other shoppers, swept across security camera positions with the practiced awareness of someone who'd studied the layout before entering. On the surface they could pass. Dark hair, both of them. Similar enough builds. She could be growing into his genetic template. Father and daughter having a disagreement. Tired parent, cranky child. A story told 1,000 times in 1,000 grocery stores. But Rufus had been reading human body language since before this man's great-great-grandparents were born. 3 centuries of observation had taught him the subtle alphabet of human interaction, the microscopic tells that separated genuine connection from performed relationships. And every signal screaming from this pair contradicted the narrative of parent and child. The girl leaned away from him, her body creating as much distance as their joined hands would allow. When he moved forward, she followed not with the casual cooperation of a child with her father, but with the mechanical compliance of someone who'd learned that resistance made things worse. The man never looked at her with affection or exasperation or any of the complex emotions Rufus had observed in actual parents. His glances toward her were checking glances, monitoring glances, the way someone watches a possession they're afraid of losing. Predator and captive. The recognition settled into Rufus's chest like a stone dropping into dark water. He'd been a predator long enough to recognize another, regardless of species. This man was hunting, even here in the fluorescent-lit safety of a suburban grocery store. And the small girl in the too bright pink sweater was his prey. The realization should have meant nothing to him. Humans preyed on each other constantly. It was their nature, just as hunting was his. In 300 years, he'd witnessed countless cruelties, infinite variations of human evil. He'd learned long ago that intervention was pointless, that mortal problems were not his concern, that the best way to survive was to remain apart. Uninvolved. But that frantic heartbeat still pulsed in his ears like a drum. That fear still coated his tongue like ash. And those wide, terrified eyes still searched the faces of strangers, looking for someone, anyone, who would see what everyone else was missing. The girl's gaze swept across the aisle, skipping past the woman with the phone, past the elderly couple, past the man with the granola bars. And then it landed on Rufus. Their eyes met and something impossible happened. She saw him. Not the careful disguise. Not the performed humanity. She saw something in his unnatural stillness, in his too pale face, in the predatory focus he'd forgotten to hide. And instead of additional fear, something like desperate hope flickered across her small face. The prey had just asked the monster for help. The moment stretched between them. Predator and child, monster and innocent. The impossible connection neither could explain. Then Helen raised her right hand high into the air. The tattooed man's grip on her left hand tightened reflexively, but he was distracted, scanning the exit near the pharmacy, calculating routes and timing. She had seconds, maybe less. Helen tucked her thumb into her palm and wrapped her fingers around it. A signal. The one her teacher had shown the class last month. The silent rescue sign that could save your life if you couldn't speak, couldn't scream, couldn't ask for help out loud. Raise your hand like you're waving, then trap your thumb and close your fist. Cry for help that makes no sound. She held it there, arm raised, hand positioned, her entire body trembling with the effort of the plea. Please see it. Please understand. Please. Rufus saw it. Course he saw it. 300 years of existence had taught him to observe everything, and the modern world had brought new languages of distress he'd made himself learn. He'd watched parents teaching their children this exact gesture in parks, in libraries, in the very aisles of stores like this one. A TikTok phenomenon turned safety tool. A way for the helpless to signal danger when danger was standing right beside them. The girl's small hand hung in the air, fingers wrapped around her thumb, trembling with fear and desperate hope. Every rational thought in Rufus's ancient mind screamed at him to look away. Intervention meant exposure. Meant revealing reflexes no human possessed, strength no human could explain, speed that would shatter 3 centuries of careful invisibility. The modern world had cameras everywhere. Phones in every pocket, security systems recording every angle. One moment of revealed truth would make him hunted, would end the fragile peace he'd built, would turn him from observer to observed. Inaction was survival. Inaction was safety. Inaction was the choice he'd made 10,000 times before when humans hurt each other in ways he could have prevented but didn't. Not my species. Not my problem. Not my war. But inaction was also complicity. That small hand in the air. That racing heartbeat. That child's terror coating his senses like poison. If he walked away, if he pretended not to see, if he let that tattooed predator drag her out of this store and into whatever darkness waited beyond, then what was he? What had 300 years of existence meant if he'd learned nothing, become nothing, stood for nothing except his own preservation? The girl's arm was beginning to lower, her hope dimming as the seconds stretched. Her eyes still locked on his, asking a question that had no words. Will you help me? Will you see me? Does anyone care enough to try? Something shifted in Rufus's chest. Something he'd thought had died in 1724 along with his mortality. A feeling that had no place in a predator's heart, that survival had taught him to bury, that centuries had nearly succeeded in killing. Conscience. The decision crystallized in an instant, clear and sharp as breaking glass. Some things mattered more than survival. Some moments defined what remained of your soul. Some choices, once made, could never be unmade, but some were worth making anyway. Rufus Tiberius had spent 300 years being a monster who pretended to be human. Perhaps it was time to be a monster who chose to be humane. His eyes met Helen's, and he gave the smallest nod. A gesture so subtle no human would notice, but enough for a desperate child watching with every ounce of hope she had left. "See you. Understand. I will help." Helen's hand lowered, but something changed in her posture. The fear remained, but it was no longer quite so alone. And Rufus began to move. Rufus moved with the practiced casualness of someone who'd spent 3 centuries learning to mimic human browsing. He drifted closer to the girl and her captor, his hand reaching out to examine a box of cornflakes with apparent interest, his movements fluid and unhurried. To any observer, he was just another evening shopper comparing breakfast cereals. But he was closing the distance. 10 feet. The predatory part of his brain calculated angles and trajectories with mechanical precision. The kidnapper was positioning himself toward the front of the store, angling for the main exit. His body language had shifted from nervous surveillance to purposeful movement. Whatever he'd come here to do, establish an alibi, waste time, appear normal, he'd decided it was finished. He was preparing to leave. With Helen, Rufus adjusted his path, moving with preternatural grace along the aisle, placing himself between the tattooed man and the most direct route to the exit. He made it look accidental, pausing to study a display of granola bars, his tall frame and long black coat creating an elegant obstacle. That's when the kidnapper noticed him. Really noticed him. The man's eyes swept across Rufus in what should have been a dismissive glance, the kind strangers exchange 100 times a day. But the glance snagged. His gaze traveled from Rufus's ornate coat to his pale face to his platinum hair, and something in his expression shifted. Unease flickered across the kidnapper's features. Rufus knew that look. Had seen it countless times over the centuries. The instinctive recognition that happened below conscious thought, the primitive part of the human brain that still remembered when humanity wasn't the apex predator. The kidnapper couldn't have explained why the pale man in the strange coat made his skin crawl, why every nerve in his body suddenly screamed wrong, wrong, wrong. But he felt it. Rufus held his gaze. Longer than polite. Longer than normal. Long enough that the social contract of eye contact became a challenge, a statement, a threat delivered without words. The kidnapper's hand tightened on Helen's, his jaw clenching. He looked away first. Had to, because something in those pale eyes made maintaining contact feel dangerous in a way his conscious mind couldn't process. "Come on," he muttered to Helen, his voice tight. He tugged her forward, harder than before, trying to move past Rufus toward the front of the store. Rufus shifted slightly, angling his body to narrow the path, forcing the man to choose between squeezing past uncomfortably close or taking the longer route around the end of the aisle. It was subtle. Nothing anyone could call out as aggressive. Just a man standing in a grocery store aisle. But the kidnapper felt the cage closing. Around them, other shoppers continued their mundane evening routines, completely oblivious to the silent confrontation unfolding. A teenage girl compared yogurt flavors while humming to her earbuds. An older man debated between 2 types of coffee. A mother negotiated with her toddler about cookies. Normal life, flowing around them like water around stones. None of them felt the tension crackling in the air. None of them noticed the way the tattooed man's breathing had quickened, or how his free hand had curled into a fist, or how his eyes kept darting to the pale stranger who seemed to be everywhere he wanted to go. Only Helen noticed. Her frightened eyes had been tracking Rufus's movements with desperate attention. She saw him position himself between them and the exit. Saw the way the bad man's confidence faltered when he looked at the strange pale figure. Saw something in the elegant stranger's deliberate movements that spoke of protection, of intervention, of help. The signal had been seen. Understood. Answered. Hope flickered in her brown eyes like a candle flame in darkness. Fragile, precious, fighting to stay lit. The kidnapper made his decision. He changed direction abruptly, pulling Helen toward the secondary exit near the pharmacy, away from the unsettling man in the black coat, away from whatever instinct was screaming at him to run. But when he glanced over his shoulder, the pale man was following. Not obviously, not aggressively, moving through the aisles with that same fluid grace, maintaining distance but never quite disappearing. Like a shadow. Like something that had locked onto prey and wouldn't be shaken loose. The kidnapper's pulse jumped. Rufus heard it, a sudden spike in the steady rhythm, fear beginning to leach into the man's scent. The hunter was becoming aware he might be hunted. "Is there a problem?" Rufus asked, his voice carrying across the distance between them. It was a simple question, spoken in a tone that was almost friendly. But there was something in the accent, something old, something foreign, something that didn't quite fit the modern American grocery store, that made it sound less like a question and more like a reckoning. The kidnapper didn't answer, just pulled Helen faster toward the pharmacy exit, his nervous energy transforming into barely controlled panic. But Rufus was already moving to cut him off, his coat billowing behind him, his pale face expressionless, his eyes locked on his target with the focused patience of something that had been hunting since before this man's grandparents were born. The chase had begun. And in a grocery store full of oblivious humans, only 3 people knew it was happening. Rufus stopped directly in the kidnapper's path, no longer pretending to browse, no longer maintaining the careful fiction of coincidental proximity. He simply stood there, tall and pale and utterly still, blocking the route to the pharmacy exit. "The child seems frightened," Rufus said. His voice carried an accent that didn't belong to any single place or time, a peculiar blend of old-world formality and linguistic patterns that had died out generations ago. The words were modern English, but the cadence was something else entirely, something that spoke of drawing rooms and gaslight and centuries that had crumbled to dust. The kidnapper pulled up short, Helen stumbling slightly at the sudden stop. His face worked through several expressions, surprise, irritation, calculation, before settling on defensive indignation. "She's my daughter," he said, the words coming too quick, too rehearsed. "Just tired. It's past her bedtime. You know how kids get." He tried for a conspiratorial smile, that universal parent-to-parent acknowledgement of child-rearing struggles. But it didn't reach his eyes. His grip on Helen's hand remained vice-tight, his body angled protectively, no possessively between her and Rufus. Rufus took one step closer. The movement should have made sound. His boots were heavy, the grocery store tile unforgiving, but his footfall was utterly, impossibly silent. One moment he was 10 feet away, the next he was 6, and the space between had been crossed without the whisper of leather on floor. The kidnapper's eyes widened slightly. Another piece of wrongness his conscious mind couldn't catalogue, but his instincts registered with alarm. "She doesn't seem tired," Rufus observed, his pale gaze dropping to Helen's face. "She seems terrified." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and for just a moment, as Rufus tilted his head slightly, the light caught his eyes at an angle. They reflected it back wrong, not the subtle red eye of a camera flash, but a genuine eyeshine, the tapetum lucidum reflection of a nocturnal predator. Cat-like, inhuman, there and gone in an instant. The kidnapper saw it. Rufus watched the man's pupils dilate, watched the color drain slightly from his face. "Look, I don't know what your problem is," the kidnapper said, his voice rising slightly, anger covering fear. "But you need to back off. This is my kid, and we're leaving." He tried to move around Rufus, pulling Helen with him. That's when Helen spoke. "He's not my daddy." The words were barely a whisper, spoken so quietly that even the nearby shoppers, the woman browsing vitamins 6 feet away, the pharmacist counting pills behind the counter, couldn't possibly have heard them. Just a breath shaped into words, a confession released at a volume that shouldn't have carried past her own lips. But Rufus heard them with perfect, crystalline clarity. Every syllable, every tremor, every ounce of desperate truth in those 4 words. His eyes snapped back to the kidnapper's face, and something changed in his expression. The careful neutrality he'd maintained, the practiced human emotion, fell away like a discarded mask. What remained was ancient, cold, utterly merciless. The kidnapper's face went white. Because he'd been watching Rufus when Helen whispered. He'd seen the man's expression change, seen the subtle shift in his posture, seen the acknowledgement of words that couldn't possibly have been heard at that distance, at that volume. "What?" the kidnapper breathed. "How did you?" His eyes darted to Helen, to Rufus, back to Helen. The math didn't work. The physics didn't work. No human could have heard that whisper from 6 feet away in a noisy grocery store. No human. The word hung unspoken between them, a revelation neither could articulate but both understood. Rufus took another silent step closer. The kidnapper stumbled backward, pulling Helen with him. His breathing ragged now. His earlier nervousness exploding into full-blown panic. "Stay away from us," he said, but his voice cracked on the words. I'll call security." "You'll what?" Rufus asked softly. "Tell them a man asked why the child is frightened. Tell them someone questioned whether she's truly yours." His head tilted slightly, the gesture eerily bird-like, predatory. "Or will you tell them the truth? That you heard me respond to a whisper impossible for human ears to detect?" Pause, heavy with meaning. "What does that make me, do you think?" The kidnapper's hand trembled on Helen's. His eyes were wide, his pupils blown, his breathing shallow and quick. The animal part of his brain was screaming at him now. Not whispers but shrieks. "Predator. Danger. Run." "Let go of the child," Rufus said. The accent was thicker now, the formality absolute. This wasn't a request. This was a command delivered with the weight of centuries, with the absolute certainty of something that had never learned to accept refusal. The standoff crystallized. 2 predators facing each other in a fluorescent-lit grocery store, a terrified child between them, and the truth of what Rufus was hanging in the air like smoke. The kidnapper's hand tightened on Helen instead of releasing her. "She's mine," he hissed, desperation making him reckless. "I've come too far. You can't, whatever you are, you can't stop me in front of all these people." "You won't." Rufus smiled then. It was a terrible expression, utterly lacking in warmth or humanity. "Won't I?" he asked. And the evening erupted into chaos. The teenage girl browsing yogurt pulled out her phone, the notification chime cutting through the ambient store noise. Her thumb swiped across the screen absently, scrolling through alerts she'd probably dismiss without reading. Then she stopped. Her eyes widened. "Oh my God," she breathed. The words were quiet, but in the tense bubble surrounding Rufus, Helen, and the kidnapper, they landed like a gunshot. The girl's hand flew to her mouth, her gaze snapping up from her phone to Helen's face. Back to the phone, back to Helen. That's her," the girl said louder now, her voice pitching up with shock. "The Amber Alert. That's the missing girl." She held up her phone, the screen displaying Helen's school photo above bold letters. "Endangered child abduction." Time fractured into sharp, terrible clarity. The woman browsing vitamins looked up. The pharmacist leaned over the counter. The elderly man with his coffee turned. One by one, phones emerged from pockets and purses, screens illuminating with the same alert, the same photo, the same desperate plea from law enforcement. Helen Crawford, 7. Abducted from Lincoln Elementary School at 3:47 p.m. Suspected abductor. Male, 35 to 40, muscular build, tattoos on arms. The crowd's attention swiveled to the tattooed man holding the little girl in the pink sweater. Suspicion crystallized into certainty in a dozen faces simultaneously. "Someone call 911. Don't let him leave. Sir, you need to stay right." The kidnapper's face twisted with cornered animal desperation. His eyes darted across the gathering crowd, the exits, the pale man blocking his path, calculating odds that were collapsing by the second. He made his choice in an instant. His hand released Helen's so abruptly she stumbled. Then he shoved hard, both palms slamming into Rufus's chest with enough force to send a normal man sprawling backward. Rufus didn't move. Didn't even rock on his heels. It was like shoving a marble statue. But the kidnapper was already moving, using the split second of attempted assault to pivot and sprint toward the emergency exit at the back of the store. His boots pounded against tile, his muscular frame weaving between frozen shoppers, knocking a display of canned goods as he ran. 50 feet to the exit. 45. 40. The crowd shouted. Someone lunged to grab him but missed. Helen cried out behind him. The emergency exit gleamed ahead, promise of escape, of darkness, of disappearing into the evening before police could arrive. 35 feet. 30. Rufus stood utterly still, watching the kidnapper run. 3 centuries of careful control warred with 3 seconds of impossible decision. Exposure meant everything he'd built would crumble. Every careful year of hiding. Every painstaking effort to remain myth rather than reality. The cameras would catch it. The phone's recording would capture it. The world would see what he was. And 300 years of peace would end in a single viral video. But if he let this man escape into the night, if he let Helen's abductor disappear into whatever hell awaited her. 25 feet. 20. Some things mattered more than survival. Rufus moved. To most of the shoppers, he simply vanished from where he'd been standing. One moment the pale man in the black coat was 6 feet away, the next he was gone. A blur of motion their eyes couldn't track, their brains couldn't process. The teenage girl with the phone gasped. The video she was recording showed nothing but a streak, a distortion in the air, like reality had glitched. 15 feet from the exit, the kidnapper was running full sprint, his hand reaching for the crash bar. 10 feet. And then Rufus was simply there. He materialized in front of the emergency exit like a photograph snapping into focus. His black coat still billowing from the speed of movement that had carried him across 50 feet of grocery store in less than a second. No running footsteps. No build-up of momentum. Just instantaneous translation from one point in space to another. Impossible. The kidnapper couldn't stop his forward momentum. He crashed into Rufus at full speed, and it was like hitting a brick wall. The impact drove the air from his lungs in a whoosh, sent him staggering backward, nearly drove him to his knees. Rufus stood unmoved, his pale eyes blazing with something that was no longer even pretending to be human. Behind them, the grocery store had fallen into shocked, terrible silence. Phones were raised, cameras recording, witnesses frozen in place. And Rufus Tiberius, the vampire king, stood revealed in fluorescent light for all the world to see. The kidnapper wheezed, trying to catch his breath, his eyes wild with panic and confusion. How had the pale man moved that fast? How was he suddenly here, blocking the only escape route? "Move," the kidnapper gasped, his voice raw with desperation. "Get out of my..." He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he lunged forward, trying to shove past Rufus, to force his way through to the exit through sheer desperation and adrenaline-fueled strength. Rufus's hand moved. The kidnapper didn't even see it. One moment the pale man's arms were at his sides, the next an iron grip had closed around his wrist, fingers wrapping completely around bone and tendon with immovable pressure. The kidnapper tried to pull free. Might as well have tried to uproot a tree with his bare hands. "Let go." He swung with his free hand, a wild haymaker aimed at Rufus's face. Rufus caught that wrist too, moving with speed that made the punch seem to hang frozen in midair. Now both of the kidnapper's arms were trapped, held in a grip that didn't bruise, didn't crush, but absolutely would not yield. The kidnapper looked into Rufus's eyes and finally saw what he was facing. They weren't human eyes anymore. The careful disguise had burned away completely, revealing something ancient staring out from behind that aristocratic face. The irises caught the fluorescent light and threw it back in shades that eyes shouldn't produce. Reflective, luminous, predatory. The pupils were slightly too large, too dark, pools of shadow that seemed to contain centuries. This wasn't a concerned citizen. This wasn't a helpful stranger. This wasn't even remotely human. "What are you?" the kidnapper whispered, his voice breaking. Rufus didn't answer. He simply adjusted his grip, lifted the man off his feet with one hand as easily as someone might lift a briefcase, and then released a precise point of pressure on his neck. The kidnapper's eyes rolled back. His body went limp instantly, consciousness fleeing like water through a sieve. He dropped like a puppet with cut strings, collapsing to the floor in a graceless heap of unconscious dead weight. Rufus stepped back, letting the body fall, his black coat billowing around him from the speed of movement. His platinum hair had come loose from its careful styling, wild now around his too pale face. His chest didn't rise and fall with breath. His posture was utterly, inhumanly still. He looked exactly like what he was. The grocery store had fallen into absolute silence. No one moved. No one spoke. Every person stood frozen, witnesses to something their rational minds couldn't process. The teenage girl's phone trembled in her hands, still recording. The elderly man gripped his coffee can with white knuckles. The mother had pulled her toddler close, protective instinct warring with paralyzed shock. At least 15 phones were raised, cameras pointed at Rufus, recording every impossible detail. The way he'd moved faster than eyes could track. The way he'd stopped a grown man's momentum without budging an inch. The way he stood now, supernatural and undeniable, in the mundane fluorescence of a suburban Savamart. 300 years of hiding, shattered in 30 seconds. "What is he?" someone whispered from the crowd. The voice was thin, frightened, awed. A woman near the pharmacy counter made a sound halfway between a gasp and a sob. "His eyes. Did you see his eyes? He moved so fast. That's not possible. Is he even breathing? What kind of?" The whispers built on each other, fear and wonder mixing into something electric. The crowd pressed backward, creating distance, a circle of space around the supernatural being standing over the unconscious kidnapper. Rufus turned slowly, his inhuman eyes sweeping across the gathered humans. Phones recording, faces pale with shock. The modern world's machinery capturing evidence that would spread across the internet within minutes. He'd spent 3 centuries as a ghost story, a myth, a legend humans told themselves wasn't real. That was over now. He stood in the terrible silence of revelation, exposed under fluorescent lights, caught on a dozen cameras, witnessed by scores of people who would never forget what they'd seen. The Vampire King had saved a child. And in doing so, he'd revealed himself to the world. But when his gaze found Helen, small and terrified but safe, standing near the cereal aisle with her hands pressed to her mouth, her brown eyes wide with shock and gratitude, Rufus felt something he hadn't experienced in 300 years. No regret. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer with each passing second. The sound cut through the shocked silence of the grocery store, a promise of authority and order rushing toward a scene that defied both. Rufus looked down at the unconscious kidnapper at his feet, then slowly backed away from the body. The crowd shifted nervously, maintaining their circle of distance, phones still recording, capturing every movement of the impossible being in their midst. He should run. Should disappear into the evening before the authorities arrived with their questions he couldn't answer, their tests he couldn't allow, their world that had no place for what he was. But then Helen moved. The little girl broke from her frozen position near the cereal aisle and ran. Not away from the supernatural creature who'd just revealed himself. Toward him. Her small feet pounded across the grocery store tile, her pink sweater bright against the fluorescent lighting, and before Rufus could process what was happening, she had wrapped her small arms around his legs and pressed her face against the dark fabric of his coat. "You came," she said, her voice muffled but clear, thick with tears and relief and gratitude. "You saw me and you came." Rufus froze. 300 years of existence. Countless hunts. Endless nights. Centuries of calculated movement and careful control. All of it stopped by a 7-year-old child's embrace. His hands hovered uncertainly over her small form, ancient and lethal, utterly undone by this moment of pure, innocent gratitude. Something cracked in his chest. Not pain but the opposite. The breaking open of something he'd sealed away so long ago he'd forgotten it existed. The store's automatic doors burst open, and a woman crashed through. Helen's mother, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wild with the desperate hope of a parent following an Amber Alert to its source. "Helen!" she cried. Her daughter's name was a sob and a prayer and a miracle all at once. She ran toward them, then pulled up short as she registered what she was seeing. Her daughter, alive and safe, clinging to a pale man in a black coat whose eyes still held traces of inhuman light. The mother's gaze met Rufus's across the small distance. He saw fear there, yes. Saw the instinctive recognition that he was something other, something dangerous, something that shouldn't exist. But beneath the fear, deeper and stronger, he saw understanding, gratitude, the complex acknowledgement of a mother who knew, didn't understand how or why but knew, that this impossible being had saved her child. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. Rufus nodded once, a slight inclination of his head. Then he gently disengaged Helen's arms from around his legs and knelt before her, bringing his pale face level with hers. "Be safe, little one," he whispered, knowing he must leave, knowing the sirens were less than a block away now. "Learn to trust your instincts. They saved you tonight." Helen's brown eyes, still wet with tears, met his inhuman ones without fear. "Will I see you again?" she asked. "I don't think so," Rufus said gently. "But you'll remember. And that matters." He rose in one fluid movement, his coat swirling around him. The crowd parted instinctively as he moved toward the back of the store, toward the loading docks and the darkness beyond. His footsteps made no sound on the tile. "Wait," someone called. "The police will want to." But Rufus was already gone. Not running, not fleeing in panic, just absent. One moment visible in the fluorescent light, the next vanished into the shadows at the back of the store as if he'd never been there at all. Smoke dissipating. A ghost returning to darkness. By the time the police burst through the front doors, 4 officers with hands on weapons, eyes scanning for the threat, the pale man in the black coat had disappeared completely. They found the unconscious kidnapper. Found the grateful mother clutching her rescued daughter. Found dozens of witnesses with shaking hands and wild stories and phone videos that would break the internet by morning. But they didn't find Rufus Tiberius. Paramedics arrived, checking Helen over with gentle efficiency while her mother held her and wept. The little girl answered their questions in a small, steady voice, letting them examine her, accepting the shock blanket they wrapped around her shoulders. But her eyes kept searching the shadows at the edges of the store, looking past the fluorescent brightness into the darkness beyond the windows. "Helen," her mother asked softly, "what are you looking for, baby?" Helen was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke, not to her mother, not to the paramedics, but to the darkness itself. Her voice was barely a whisper, but she spoke with the absolute certainty that the right ears would hear her. "Thank you, Mr. Vampire." The words hung in the evening air like smoke. Somewhere in the night, blocks away and moving farther with each silent step, Rufus Tiberius smiled. It was a rare expression, genuine and warm, something he'd thought he'd lost sometime in the 1800s along with so many other human things. But here it was, called back to life by a child's whispered gratitude. He'd been revealed, been recorded, been witnessed by dozens. Tomorrow would bring consequences. The videos would spread. Questions would be asked. The careful peace of his 3 centuries of hiding was over. But tonight a child was safe. And that, Rufus discovered, was enough. That day a monster chose mercy. And a little girl taught a vampire king what it meant to be human.